So this is the final talk on Alice Walker's everyday use. It's a fascinating story. It's just really engaging if you read it and sort of pay attention to what Alice Walker is quite deviously doing. She's writing an interesting critique and asking the question about what is the nature of heritage, what is the nature of life, and of course that has a lot to do with the title. The title is called Everyday Use, and it seems that that Alice Walker is on the side of everyday use. That is, that our heritage is something that should be part of our lived life. The heritage is about human experience and the retention of human experience. But she's also doing an interesting thing where she critiques the effort that African Americans, a tragic effort, of course, that is demonstrated in both Dee and Dee's companion, the tragic effort by African Americans to develop a heritage that is that does not have the shame that is associated with slavery, the shame that is associated with Jim Crow, the shame that is associated with the racism of white superiority, right, white supremacist attitudes and ideas. And it's a theme that runs throughout. We've seen it in Langston Hughes arguing that in the event that we start to dislike ourselves and destroy ourselves in the process, instead of embracing the black heritage and the black narrative of self, the great danger is that the very racism that we seem to be fighting and going against is what is actually creating in us a hatred and a dislike of ourselves. It's a fascinating thought. James Baldwin, in a beautiful commentary at one point, makes the same point. It's a piece that you can find online where there are interesting recordings of James Baldwin talking, where he recognizes that one of the most pernicious damages of racism is not its physical violence, but it's the ways in which it can lead to a self-loathing in the African American sense of self, a self-loathing that is destructive and that's negative. And he says that is the most damaging thing, and the need to be free of that would be important. So Dee seems to be moving towards a sense of um, her liberation of self, sort of finally embracing who she is, but she's still outside of it. She still wants to take a picture of her mother so that she can show her friends that she comes from a poor place, but not because, not as a way of celebrating the dignity of that poverty, the dignity of that life that she's created. The mother has built her own house, right? She built her own house. This is a mother who is independent. But that's not what drives Dee. Dee wants to show that I came from something, to show that she's elevated herself beyond that. And therefore, she treats her past and her heritage not as a living entity, not something that functions for her everyday existence, but something that's outside of herself. It's a very complicated and very sophisticated critique of the struggle of African Americans. And it's interesting because, of course, Alice Walker doesn't care to tell this story to white America. She's actually writing her stories, as she says again and again, for African Americans, for black people to see themselves and to think about themselves and to think about themselves through their own internal gaze and through their own internal understanding of themselves. This is something that the amazing and brilliant Toni Morrison would talk about. And Toni Morrison would observe that far too often there is a way in which she had to struggle to resist the temptation of writing her work with the pressure of the wide gaze, the expectation of her of that wide gaze, understanding the work and paying attention to it, that she would feel that she had to explain to white society this culture. And Toni Morrison described her liberation when she read some African novels and said those African novels taught her something about not working, not working with the white gaze, but with the black gaze, with her own, with the black African perspective, the black perspective. And in a sense, Toni Morrison says once she understood that, she began to open up the ways in which she could think about her writing and the possibilities that are in her writing, to find a voice that doesn't demand explaining her culture to another culture, in the same way that Shakespeare never tried to explain British culture, just wrote it out of its own self. Um, uh, William Faulkner is not trying to explain um, white American culture and so on and so forth. He's just writing it out of himself. Yet there was this demand placed on the African American to be constantly explaining to the other culture, to the European culture, the Western culture, the white culture, what African Americans are about. It's a fascinating kind of question that we've looked at from the slave narratives all the way up. Who are the writers writing for? We begin with the slave narratives writing for white readers, and then we are moving into African American writers writing for African Americans. And there's a way in which that difference becomes profoundly telling and profoundly powerful. And of course, we see that demonstrated in the work of Alice Walker. So much to say, but that's where we'll stop.